I have one. One of the things that I have been thinking about with this process, and tell me if this makes any sense, was the paternalism that seems to run through a lot of this. And by that I mean, often, you kind of talk about this idea of sports saving these poor young black men. And they're also often framed as fatherless. And I thought of this story of Kellen Winslow Jr. and his father kind of objecting to the recruiters going around him as if they assumed there was no father. And I just kind of thought, that made me think of the idea of the coaches as these kind of father figures, as saviors. It's framed that way. I don't know if their relationships are actually played out that way, but it seems to be often in the discourse. And so these are father figures who step up to teach them how to be a man, and by which we mean kind of a middle class, kind of acceptable to, white majority, man. And does that happen? Does it look like that in the college system? Does it continue in the pro system? And does that contribute to difficulties of athletes rebelling in a sense? If they're framed that way and it's set up that way, and this also kind of pluralistic kind of father-son teaching masculinity way that makes it hard to reject that authority.
No, I think you're correct. And one thing I've always said, well, when you're a kid, the worst thing you could ever do is to be responsible for your parents' well-being, right? I always feel bad for child stars. They keep the lights on in their houses. That's why your coach can't be your father, right? The idea that the coach is the father figure, no, because your father's well-being is dependent upon your performance. You can't have that. That's the wrong thing. It's the paternalism is staggering. It's bigger than I think people realize, and it's so ingrained that people don't think about it. So there was a story last year. The Rams drafted this malcontent named Janoris Jenkins, who I don't think he was that poorly behaved. He's got a bunch of kids out of wedlock and couldn't pass a drug test, but okay, right? Anyway, he wound up going to the Rams. The Rams drafted him, and the Rams told him that they would not allow him to sign his contract unless he agreed to sign on with a financial advisor. A financial advisor who coincidentally was the head coach's financial advisor. And people looked at me like I had something wrong with me because I thought that was insane. They're like, well, if more of these guys had somebody looking out for them, they wouldn't have these problems. No, the problem most of these guys have is they sign up for bad financial advisors and their money evaporates, right? But the idea that somebody would think it was appropriate and then to say on the back end of it, well, he needs somebody to help him with his money, so you make him do it. You're allowed to set your money on fire if you want to do something. That is an example of the paternalism. Another one I think on the father figure thing with Coach that is really interesting is this year at signing day, so I guess this is a month ago. Kid's name is Landon Collins. He played running back in Florida. He's a 5-star recruit from Fort Lauderdale or something like that. So his mother has this laundry list of issues, substance abuse being one of them. The young man wound up moving out of his mother's house and in with his high school coach. Because we all know high school coaches just do this for any old football player, but especially the 5-stars, right? This blindside sort of thing that's become fetishized. So he goes and lives with his coach. His coach happens to be good friends with Brett Bielema, the head football coach at Arkansas. The kid decides that he wants to commit to Arkansas, and that's where he wants to sign his letter of intent to go. Signing day comes around. Your mother has to sign your letter of intent. And his mother took the letter of intent and jetted out of town, and everybody's talking about, well, how dare his mother do this when this young man obviously wants to go to Arkansas. I'm like, let me get this straight. You're telling me that a kid from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, wants to go spend 4 years in Arkansas, and coincidentally, his high school coach, who he coincidentally lives with, and that coach who coincidentally is friends with the head coach at Arkansas. But I'm supposed to look at his mother as being the one who has her own personal agenda. You see what I'm saying? That's how built into this that the paternalism happens to be, that I'm supposed to believe necessarily that this coach, who has so much to gain from this player, has the player's best interest more so at heart than his mother. The blind side, part of the blind side that people don't like to talk about as it carries over, is the current coach at the University of Mississippi was Michael Orr's head coach in high school. So he got a job off of this by riding Michael Orr all the way to Ole Miss. But I'm supposed to assume this boy's mother, problems though she may have, cares less about his well-being than this high school coach who put a stamp on this boy and sending him to Fayetteville, Arkansas.
I think it's interesting the way the paternalism doesn't stop at the college level. And I think David Leonard's book talks about this a lot. So his book talks about the malice at the palace, the big brawl that happened at a Pistons game. So I can't remember how long ago it was. 2004. And talking about how in the aftermath of that, the media is, and this happens whenever, athletes get in trouble with the law or otherwise, saying that these are, children, these people can't control themselves, they need some kind of structure in place to, make sure that they, aren't jumping into the stands or aren't getting arrested or aren't getting into trouble. And these are, the same exact types of arguments that people use against free blacks in the antebellum South, saying that these people can't survive in freedom, they can't, they're just going to, get drunk and gamble and lose all their money, that they need the structure of the slave system in order to kind of keep them in line. The parallels between the two, discourses are striking.
No, it's fascinating you mentioned that because when people talk about whether the slavery argument is inappropriate or not, I taught a class at Duke in the spring of 2008 called The Black Athlete in America, and I'd never taught a class before, so I was like, I never forget, I was talking to my father's a professor, and he looks at me and says, so I forget what exactly the term was he used, but basically he's just like, so what's the common theme for the class going to be? I was like, shit, man, I was just going to get up there and talk. So all of a sudden I had to, come up with the structure. And what I did, wound up doing was, I took 6 athletes. I took Jack Johnson, Jackie Robinson, Ali, Jim Brown, Michael Jordan, Allen Iverson, and got pretty good bios on all of them and some supplementary text to go around them. And it was startling how we found the similarity in the rhetoric had not changed between Jack Johnson and Allen Iverson. It simply had not. It was the same thing. So we talk about that, the idea, that he's going to get drunk and and all this stuff. All those things you talk about in sports, all these things keep carrying over. We just don't call them race anymore. It's the carryover of the Ronald Reagan 1980s, where the brilliance of Ronald Reagan was his ability to speak in code. And we've coded it up so far that people do not realize they do it so reflexively, it's so default, that they don't realize they're saying the same thing they've been saying for 200 years. And that paternalism right there is, without white people, how in the world are black people going to survive? Or more accurately, without white people, how are we going to keep these black people from killing white people or stealing from white people or whatever it is? Who's going to make them work hard? That's the big thing in the NBA. Nobody works hard, right? All these arguments, somebody's got to make them work hard. Somebody's got to get them to do all of this, and it all ties right back to this Kipling-esque sort of paternalism.